Well, that was the year that was. It has ended as freakishly, as violently as it began. Doesn't get much more freakish when a gay atheist Saudi who has been living in Germany for 20 years, bewailing Germany's role in the Islamification of Europe, denouncing Islam at every turn, commits the kind of atrocity in a Christmas market in Magdeburg in the eastern part of Germany that ISIS and Al-Qaeda themselves would have been proud of. What was he up to? Was he a lone deranged wolf, or is he involved in some kind of deception, some kind of psyop conspiracy? It ended, more or less, in the freakish fall of the Syrian Arab Republic, its dismemberment between the United States, Turkey, and Israel, with a bit left over for the rebranded ISIS and Al-Qaeda, now done up in suits. In fact, pretty soon it will be a tuxedo that their leader is welcoming Western governments flooding in. People who had him on their wanted for terrorism list until days after he came to power in Damascus. $10 million you could have got for identifying his whereabouts, but now we know where he is. He is in power in Damascus. What the eventual price of that power will be remains to be seen. Will the Kurds be allowed to hang on to an enclave? Will the United States defend the Kurds against Turkish depredation? Israel now has 5 times the size of the Gaza Strip inside occupied Syria. And, of course, the Takfiri mindset is such that schism and multiplication is the likely outcome in those parts of Syria that the HTS are allowed to control. So even if this Ashara, as he's now known, Golani as he was previously known, even if he wants to avoid sectarian killing, mutilation, beheading, and the rest, well, the motley crew that he brought with him are not so easily controlled. And what about the thousands of ISIS prisoners in the Kurdish American-held sector? What if they break out? Where are they headed to? In fact, these foreign fighters that were victorious so remarkably towards the end of this year in conquering Damascus itself, how long are they going to hang around in Syria? When will they fan out across the globe to spread their murder and mayhem everywhere? Coming to a Christmas market near you, perhaps. But the wars that raged in the Ukraine and the shooting war with ballistic missiles of unbelievable ferocity and complexity, sophistication between Israel, the apartheid state, and the Islamic Republic of Iran was one of the biggest stories of the year. The stalemate between the two appears to have endured, although one can never tell when it's going to break out again. One thing that is for sure, the unending agony of the Palestinian people in Gaza, but also in the West Bank, also in Holy Jerusalem, continues. It is a Calvary. It is a Via Dolorosa. It is a crucifixion of a people that has reached, one presumes, its apogee, although, again, one can never be sure that it might not get even worse. The daily, hour by hour, minute by minute televising of a Holocaust. Imagine if there had been the live streaming of Auschwitz or Treblinka. Well, that's what there has been coming out of Gaza. And those of us who cannot stay away from it wonder why so few others are interested in it at all. The whole world is fixated on an image that I never thought I'd see, of a disabled woman literally burning to death on a New York City subway train. The door is open. Her body is clearly visible. She is in flames, dying, murdered, and no one is going to her help. The whole world is looking at that image. But exactly the same image happened time after time after time in Gaza, in tents, where women, children, and men burned alive, and nobody came to their assistance either. You've come to the right place to reflect on the year that was 2024. Welcome to Have It Out with Galloway. Danny Haiphong, an author, journalist, and analyst, is one of the biggest figures on social media. He's host of the self-titled YouTube show covering geopolitical developments shaking up the world around us. And frankly, it is peerless. He has hundreds of thousands of followers and millions of viewers. He joins us now on Have It Out with Galloway. Danny, thank you. Wonderful, as always, to see you. I tried to give a taste there in a short monologue of 2024, but I could have spoken for 25 or 55 minutes about 2024. It was a remarkable year. What stood out during it for you?
What stood out to me, George, and it's an honor and pleasure to be here, thanks so much for the invitation, is how critical the geopolitical scene has become, moving toward truly a World War III scenario on all fronts. So in your monologue, you mentioned Gaza, and we all should be paying attention to the plight of the Palestinian people, because that has endured, this genocide has endured for the entire year. But what we should also make note of is how this genocide in Gaza broke out into an all-out regional war, which now with the fall of Syria looks like a very difficult period for the axis of resistance. But over this period, the axis of resistance grew stronger. Iran and Israel took part in direct strikes on each other's territory. And this all portends what the future of West Asia is going to be, which is a massive global geopolitical war, which the United States, as a declining empire, is going to continue to fuel from here to come. So that's just one element that I was watching out for in 2024, one of the big highlights. Another huge highlight, of course, is the fact that we are now in year 3 of the conflict in Ukraine, and that this conflict has only escalated toward its own kind of World War III scenario, where we have Russia and the United States directly trading jabs and strikes against each other via Ukraine. We've seen Russia launch its historic Oreshnik missile, which is unmatched in military technology. And we are going to continue to see, going into Trump 2.0 in 2025, the continuation of these tensions, because in both of these arenas, George, we know that the ultimate target is the leaders of the multipolar world, Russia and China. So these huge highlights, all of these atrocities that the United States and its collective West allies have partaken in, all of the disastrous, the genocidal, the mass death, the crises that we see in these two big hotspots in the world, all lead down this road. The fall of Syria, the ultimate agenda of war with Iran, the ultimate agenda of war in Ukraine, they all lead to the same place, which is a United States-led war on Russia and China. Those were my big highlights, and I think we have to place the plight of the Palestinians as well as the plight of all people around the world who have suffered from this and who will suffer from this now with the fall of Syria in this context.
We'll turn to Trump 2.0 as you describe it in a minute, but let's look at the Joe Biden era coming to an end very fast. The Wall Street Journal, that house journal of the American elite, has treated us for the last week or so to the horror story that was the Biden administration. It turns out they revealed that Biden was actually clinically senile, suffering from dementia, before he even entered the White House in 2020, and that they were all lying about it throughout. All the journalists, all the officials, all the generals, they were all lying about the fact that the Western world was being led by a dribbling idiot. Who was really running the show then? And what was their goal, and did they achieve it?
If 2024 taught us anything, George, it's that the United States, in all realms of policy, is controlled by an unelected elite that sits in corporate boardrooms, that sits within the unelected deep state. That is who runs the United States. It is the intelligence agencies, it is the bureaucrats, and then it is those who pay their salaries, the lobbyists, the corporations, the monopolies, etc. That is who has been running this. And of course, the figureheads around all of this are people like Mr. Sullivan, Jake Sullivan, Antony Blinken, these types, functionaries, complete careerists with absolutely no independent thought in their minds beyond what will serve the empire. So Joe Biden's presidency has been a disaster. In 2020, you mentioned that they all knew this already. Well, so should have the American public, because during the 2020 election, there were a lot of questions. It was a historically baffling election, if we remember it, especially the Democratic Party primary. There were about 10 plus candidates all running to try to essentially snuff out Bernie Sanders' campaign. Then they all united around Joe Biden at the end to do just that. But even during that time, there were a lot of comments about Joe Biden's gaffes, they would call them. These snafus, these little mistakes he would make when he would talk, he would forget things. And all of that should have told us that he already wasn't in his right mind. Now, policy-wise, Joe Biden has always been horrendous. He's always been a servant of the oligarchy and one of the most loyal, given the fact that he is the top recipient of APEC money, essentially in the history of the United States, still holding that leadership role to this day. But with that combination of cognitive decline, we have seen the unelected deep state, these oligarchs, these careerists, take the world to the precipice and completely neglect the needs of U.S. workers, which has made Joe Biden's presidency one of the worst in U.S. history.
It was a battle between the old world and the new. It's a cliche, Gramsci's line that the old world is dying, the new world is struggling to be born. We live in the time of monsters. But it all came true in the last year. But I want to put it to you that the old world is not as close to death as we liked to think. The new world is not so close to birth as we were hoping for. There's all still to play and fight for between the old world and the new world, isn't there?
Yes, and I believe that this was always the case. And it is easier to have optimism when there is momentum behind the side of the multipolar world. And it's more difficult to have that optimism when it appears that certain events like the collapse of the Syrian Arab Republic occur. However, I believe that overall, my assessment of the situation is that at this point, the United States empire, if we look at it as the unipolar world, the old world that remains dominant, even in victory, there are many hurdles, many challenges, and many defeats. I just note about Syria, for example, the United States has for many years now had to conceal its involvement in the overthrow of the Syrian government to a much greater degree. And that is because, if we remember in 2014, the direct involvement of the United States in the affairs of Syria was becoming increasingly unpopular. And so now that the United States has essentially gotten what it's wanted in this particular arena, I think that what we are actually seeing is the United States' role and capacity to manage its affairs as an empire is diminishing greatly. And Syria is a big example of this. Now you have, as you so articulately stated, George, in your monologue, a consortium of forces that are going to make governing Syria essentially impossible, where you have bigger powers, although I would say still small compared to the United States, like Turkey, attempting to assert its influence. And then you have, of course, the head choppers who will be vying for influence throughout. And then, of course, you have Israel. And you still have the United States attempting to occupy their own set of territory in Syria. All of this could turn into a disastrous quagmire for everybody involved, not least because we have a model of this, although it's somewhat different because there wasn't a 6-month bombing campaign on top of it. The situation in Libya essentially turned out to be a complete and utter disaster, which the United States had no ability to control. So while the United States' empire, the unipolar order, is certainly not going to collapse tomorrow, I believe we already see a lack of capacity to control events without the use of its very untrustworthy allies like Israel, like Turkey. And that is going to create big problems for the United States to maintain its influence. And I believe, too, that we will still see Russia and China moving forward continue to build and gain momentum in their own right because they do possess certain advantages that other countries in the multipolar world just don't have. We just saw that with Syria. We saw Syria, a country so embattled, so beleaguered, so under siege, just wasn't able to maintain itself. But that's not the case for Russia and China. And I believe that the more something like Syria happens, the more we see the overreach of the United States, Israel, and the like, the more we will see peoples and countries all over the world move further toward the multipolar world. So even though momentum may not be as fast at this moment, I believe the momentum is still going in that direction anyway.
Now, Donald Trump will be along again before you could say Jack Robinson. How are you looking forward or not to that? After all, Donald Trump has pledged to end the war in Ukraine. He doesn't seem to fancy little Zelensky much. I think the prospect of unending billions, hundreds of billions, pouring into Zelensky's coffer is practically zero. That's one Donald Trump. The other Donald Trump is the one that pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal, who murdered the late General Qasem Soleimani, who moved the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem. Which Donald Trump is going to show up in January, do you think?
We're probably going to see a combination of all of the Trumps that you have just mentioned, George. But I think his first 90 days are going to be very interesting and very critical to watch because there will be a lot of pressure on Donald Trump to establish himself coming back in after all of what has transpired in the United States to assert the US's role in the world as a dominant player, as an empire. Because one of the big problems that the United States as an empire has had, if we look at it from its perspective, is the loss of legitimacy around the world, the inability to manage these affairs, as I stated earlier, to look as if while it is causing all of this great chaos, it is unable to pull back, to make any kind of strategic move to ensure stability, let alone peace and let alone justice, which the United States empire will never, ever put into practice. So Donald Trump will have a lot of pressure on his administration to do something about Ukraine, to address the situation in West Asia, to also address China. And all of this, I believe, will have many contradictory elements. And it'll be very interesting to see where he ends up going on any of these things, because I don't think it is necessarily predictable. The ruling elite, those who control the United States' foreign policy, the foreign policy establishment, they will want to see all three fronts escalated, but that is untenable for the United States. The United States is going to have to find places to pull back as it escalates in others. That, I believe, is going to be the overall strategy of Donald Trump. And one prediction I have is that there will be an attempt to pivot even harder to West Asia, perhaps toward Iran, maybe flirt with an Iran nuclear deal, but it will not be a fair deal for Iran, leading to possibly even further escalations with Iran, which Donald Trump has a history of doing. China, of course, we could see Donald Trump up the ante on China via economic warfare. We already know that he's promised to do that despite his kind words to Xi Jinping. And then with Ukraine, this one will be very difficult because there is no appetite within the foreign policy establishment and the military industrial complex to pull back on that war. But there's a lot of pressure to do so, given the reality on the ground that Russia is not going to be defeated. And actually, Russia is going to win this war on the timetable that Russia sets. So that will put a lot of pressure on Donald Trump, given his campaign promises, given the actual situation on the ground, to address it. How that will look, that's a whole other question entirely. Will the ruling establishment even allow him to even think about a fair deal with Russia? I don't believe so. And so I believe that the talks are likely going to lead to very little, because I believe that Russia, from everything that Russia said and where Russia is now, is going to want a deal with the United States that essentially meets all of its terms. And there will be very few terms that Russia will want to give up, given that the United States is likely to present its own terms in particularly absurd ways. We've seen the Keith Kellogg plan essentially just wanting to freeze the conflict. I don't think Russia wants a freeze unless it gets everything that it wants. And it has all of the leverage to demand such a thing.
Here's a left field suggestion, Danny. What about a couple of cheap wins for Donald Trump? Invading Haiti and invading Panama, taking back control of the canal, dealing with what they insultingly call America's backyard, doesn't bring them nose to nose with any of these superpowers. Easy wins. What do you think about that?
Well, this would be in keeping with how the Trump administration in its first iteration attempted to manage its foreign policy. We saw that Latin America became a key target of Donald Trump. We know that the Trump administration tried to directly overthrow Venezuela's government, and in trying to do this, succeeded in placing starvation sanctions on the country, which nearly led to its economic collapse. Thankfully, that didn't occur because Venezuela reoriented its economy. But nonetheless, there is a track record of this, and it would be absolutely unsurprising if Donald Trump went these routes. I don't know about the first 90 days, but certainly over the next 4 years, should he make it that far, that is a big possibility, because the United States empire doesn't rest. There are these huge flashpoints, these huge geopolitical aims and goals that the empire has. But those goals, as I said earlier, in my estimation, are actually out of reach. While the United States empire may not decline and collapse, unipolarity may not be over tomorrow, there is absolutely no way, if you look at the layout and the strategic situation in the world, that we can see the United States going to war with Russia directly, going to war with China directly, even Iran, without a potentially nuclear situation igniting. And that means the end of everybody. So with that said, the United States will have to look at its overall posture. We see even Somaliland, right? This attempt by Donald Trump and his administration to claim that Somaliland is its own independent territory. That is all part of the overall policy in Africa that the United States has, which is to try to isolate Russia and China, kick them out of the African continent militarily and economically, and in doing so, militarizing the African continent for those aims. And so I believe that's what the whole Somaliland issue is about. And it is smaller, at least on the geopolitical scale, than these other flashpoints we've been talking about, and are completely within the realm of possibility of where Donald Trump's administration may set its focus in order to do exactly what I said earlier, which is to establish itself as a serious presidential administration.
The enemy never sleeps, but thankfully neither does Danny Haiphong, and me for that matter. Danny, thanks for joining us. Let's turn to the studio audience on the video wall. And let's take, first of all, Warren Thornton, who's a well-known journalist in the West Country of England. Warren, what would you like to say?
First of all, many happy, should I say, very Merry Christmas to you.
Thank you.
Given that the idea of EU troops in Ukraine is just in essence a NATO backdoor entry into Ukraine, will President Trump be A, smart enough to recognise this, and B, will he be smart enough to walk away from NATO altogether?
Well, you know, I think, Warren, that the coming struggle for Donald Trump will be very important. There are people in his circle, like Tulsi Gabbard, like Tucker Carlson, to some extent like Robert Kennedy Jr., and to some extent like Elon Musk, who would actually prefer to make money and to settle some of their long-standing goals. In Kennedy's case, the war for America's health, against Big Pharma and so on. In the case of Musk, greater and greater reach and all the way to Mars, if he can get there. Carlson is in a learning curve, second to none anywhere in the world. He's emerged as the greatest broadcaster in the world, but a man in transition from one political animal to another. They're on one side of the table, fighting for Trump's attention and agreement. But there are, of course, many others, malignant actors from the swamp, people like Marco Rubio, like Lindsey Graham, and others. So it's by no means certain whether Trump is going to go this way or that. Most likely, as Danny Haiphong just said, we'll see all of these Trumps from time to time. We'll see him doing the right thing here, at the same time doing the wrong thing there. And coherence is not something I'm expecting from the new Trump administration. But like a stopped clock, he might be right twice a day. Thanks for that, Warren. Meshach Taylor is a teacher in England's Stansted area. Meshach, what would you like to say?
George, given in light of the resistance in Yemen holding firm and delivering some strategic blows, what do you think is their role now in terms of Syria and Palestine?
Well, Yemen is now the outlier in the Arab world. It is the only state in the Arab world that maintains belligerence against the Israeli occupation of Palestine, the genocide in Gaza. It is the last castle of Arab dignity, and it has its Arab and Islamic identity absolutely pristine and intact. And that makes it a very big target for the empire. To this point in time, Yemen has demonstrated not just courage beyond imagination in the Arab world, but a level of skill and warrior spirit that surprises even me as an admirer of the Yemeni people. All of my life, almost literally all of my life, the first anti-imperialist struggle I recall supporting was the one in 1968, the uprising in the crater in Yemen, in the crater district where the Yemeni people were fighting British soldiers, Scottish soldiers for their freedom. Even someone like me is amazed at the regularity and the level of skill involved in their delivery of these strategic blows that you described. But the enemy has begun to strike back. The level of savagery of the UK-US alliance attack on Sana'a, the capital, just the other day. Well, I mean, the video was spectacular. The regular attacks on the ports, on the infrastructure, and now on the people in Yemen is very, very high. But the leader of Ansar Allah, the resistance movement there in Yemen, said yesterday they can hit us if they like with atomic bombs, but they will never stop us fighting for Gaza and for the dignity and the survival of the Palestinian people. I found it difficult to read those words without shedding a tear, especially when I compare and contrast them with the silence elsewhere in the Arab world. So I expect that the Yemenis will fight to the last man. Their sanctions that they have imposed on the Red Sea are now virtually total. No ship can pass the Red Sea if it's on its way to or from the genocide state of Israel. And those that want to patrol the Red Sea to give safe passage to the Israeli shipping is coming under remorseless attack, and I've lost count of the number of vessels from Western countries seeking to police the sea for Israel that have gone down into Davy Jones's locker. It is a truly extraordinary story, and not enough people think about it and talk about it. I'm glad that you did. Thank you for that. Tom Sullivan, another well-known journalist in London. He's up next. Tom, what have you got?
Hi, George. Good to speak to you as always. If you allow me briefly, I just want to pick up two things and kind of ask one question based on it. So I think we've kind of seen that as we approach Trump actually going into office, being inaugurated, we're seeing a lot of banana peels being thrown under the wagon. Joe Biden started it by approving ATACMS, which then allowed us, the British lapdog, to approve our Storm Shadow. I don't know if there's any truth in it, but there are reports today coming out of Russia that Moldova's pro-EU president, who won by a whisker, is potentially getting plans to invade Transnistria, which has been, as you know, it has Russian soldiers, it's on the border of Ukraine, it's been a frozen conflict since 1992. And suddenly out of the blue, in December 2024, she thinks that's a good thing to do. So we have this kind of alliance of evil merging between neocons in Washington and the as self-proclaimed fluffy pro-EU liberals in Europe. Do we have, George, a strong enough alliance of good forming to counter that? I remember the other day on Piers Morgan, Piers was shocked to find out that you were rooting for a Trump victory. Those of us who know you are less shocked. But my general question to you is, do you believe that there is forming, or that we're able to form an alliance of good, whether it's left, right, whatever you want, whatever these labels, Christian, Muslim, whatever it is, against these forces of evil, which do happen to be coalescing right now more than ever?
Wow, what a brilliant question. I'm grateful to you for it. I did see these reports emanating from Moldova, which is itself a fake country. And you mentioned that the leader of Moldova was re-elected by a whisker, and that only because they rigged it. So imagine if they had not rigged it, what that whisker would have looked like. They effectively disenfranchised all the Moldovan citizens that were living in Russia, a huge number, and did everything that they could to ensure the outcome amongst Moldovan exiles. The vote on the basis of the people actually in Moldova would have seen her comprehensively defeated. Counting the votes fairly of the Moldovans living in Western countries would have seen her defeated decisively. and allowing the votes. They only had one polling station in all of Russia for the Moldovans, who are spread right across the country there. So this is a very rickety chair, the Moldovan government. If they were to launch a military attack on Transnistria, it will be the last thing they ever do, that's for sure, because the Transnistrian people are Russian people, just like the people in the Donbass are Russian people. Moreover, the Russian armed forces are there, perfectly legally, as part of a peacekeeping operation, which, as you say, arises from a conflict now more than 30 years old. So it's also got, by the way, the world's largest ammunition dump in Transnistria. And the idea that Russia is going to allow an EU satrapy to take over and potentially destroy a territory which is Russia, in essence, is fanciful. So any attack on Transnistria, I expect the airborne forces of the Russian Federation to stiffen the ranks of their peacekeepers, probably to the power of 100, if not 1,000, and that'll be another front, another Ukraine, fought more or less within a stone's throw of Ukraine. The best solution is for the Russian advance to take all of the coastline, link up the Novorus territories, including Transnistria, and let Moldova do what it wants, although the Romanian people have a point of view on Moldova, which is a breakaway from Romania, which was once upon a time a part of the Soviet Union. Do we have an axis of good enough to stand up to the axis of evil? Well, we'll soon know, I think, in 2025. Let's go to Dar es Salaam, the House of Peace, where Sakina Habib has a question. Sakina, welcome.
Thank you so much, George, for having me on the program. My question is that why is it that the Western leaders are celebrating Assad's fall as an opportunity for Syrians while remaining totally silent as Israel continues to invade and steal their land? And what does Syria's fate hold now after Jalani's rule?
Well, I've got to tell you that to ask that, Sakina, is akin to asking why does a scorpion sting? The truth is, what's happened to Syria was what they wanted to happen all along. There is no contradiction between freeing Syria and granting some of the prime land and water of Syria to Israel. This was their plan. The people who fought to overthrow the Syrian government knew that that was their plan. It's a quid pro quo. We will help you to overthrow the al-Assad government, and in return, you will expel the Palestinian resistance. You will disarm the Syrian people, and you will allow Israel to occupy a very considerable part of your country. You know, Israel is 20 kilometers away from Damascus. It could drive into Damascus in 25 minutes, any time that it liked. Who's going to stop them? The Syrian armed forces have been destroyed. The Syrian weaponry has been eliminated. And a group of people who are, for the moment, I stress for the moment, because you can never be sure when you build a Frankenstein monster when it will break out of your control, but for the moment is entirely under your control. Ken Lovegrove is in British Columbia and has pre-recorded a question. Let's hear it.
Hi George, with the removal of Assad in Syria, are we just seeing Israeli opportunism? We know that Netanyahu has openly promoted the Greater Israel Project. Or are we seeing this driven by the USA, who want to maintain the US petrodollar by controlling the Middle East, and Israel is their proxy? Just to put the question into perspective, 50%, China gets 50% of its oil from the Middle East, 10% from Iran, 12% from Iraq, and the rest from Saudi Arabia. We know that Israel and the USA, they talk about regime change in Iran. You yourself think they'll take down Iraq first, before Iran. So ultimately, is this just a USA grand strategy to control the Middle East and the flow of oil, using Israel as a proxy to undermine China? So who's really driving this, George? Is this the USA driving it, or is it Israel?
I honestly think that that's a distinction without a difference. What is the action of Israel, what is the intention of Israel, cannot be separated from the action and intention of the United States. Israel is but the client of the United States. Of course, clients have different levels of independence of thought, but they don't have independence of action any more than the United Kingdom has independence of action from the United States. I mean, we can't even fire our nuclear weapons without a second key being turned in Washington, in the Pentagon, by the American military. So clients don't get to take independent action. They can run off at the mouth, as Netanyahu frequently does, but they will not be able to act without the agreement of the United States. So I honestly think there's no difference between these two things. It's ultimately the head of the dog that wags the tail. Let's go to my old friend Fra Hughes in Belfast. Go ahead, Fra.
Hello, George. Great to see you and great to speak to you again. George, I wanted to talk about Syria, if that's okay. There's been a national, regional, international, and global convergence of agendas to see the destruction of the Syrian Arab Republic. But I'd just like to focus on two groups, please. One is what I call the pseudo-imperialist left. This is people like the Socialist Workers' Party, who cannot get elected in Ireland under that banner, so they go with people before profit as a wider electoral vehicle. They were cheerleading the fall of Gaddafi. They're cheerleading the fall of Assad. They claim to be supporting a people-driven led revolution against historic dictatorships. They are actually cheerleading the fall of a secular state. So socialists who claim to believe in secularism are happy to see a secular state crumble. Now, the other part of the equation I'd like to bring up is the sectarian nature of those involved in bringing about the fall of Assad, that being HTS and others. These people being sectarian cheerleaders who call for Christians to go to Beirut and Alawites to go to the grave. So we have a convergence of the pseudo-imperialist left with Islamic conservative fundamentalists who are both on the same page when it comes to the destruction of a secular state within West Asia. I'm just going to ask your opinion. Is there a connection somewhere between what I call the pseudo-imperialist left and the people on the right, like those connected with the Muslim Brotherhood, who appear to be intent more on killing the Shias in Lebanon and the Shias in Iran, and claim to be supporting Palestine, but at the same time are more involved in the sectarian conflict than they are against the Israeli imperialism within the region? Is there a connection, or is it just a convergence of agendas?
Well, I mean, your question is so brilliantly expressed that scarcely needs an answer, and the viewer will easily reach a conclusion on it. These people have always been two sides of the same coin, or more rudely, two cheeks of the same backside. These so-called third campists, neither Washington nor Moscow, of course, inevitably, in fact, leaves you in Washington if you are not prepared to take a side, the side that is on all objective reasoning closest to you. Then you are in fact opting for those with whom they are in battle. And that's what the role of these Toy Town Trotskyists has always been. The good news is nobody's listening or caring about them. They have never been more minuscule, these groupuscules of the ultra-left, far-left. What they do have is a couple of silos, and those silos are important. They've got a silo in the Stop the War coalition in Britain. They've got a silo in the Palestine Solidarity campaign in London. Most of the people who go on the demonstrations and events have no idea who's inside that silo, and if they did, they'd walk by quite quickly. But it must actually occur to somebody sometime why I, as a founder of both and as a pillar of both for decades, have not spoken on either of these platforms for more than 10 years. Surely it must occur to someone, especially when I'm actually on the demonstration walking. But the truth is that the opportunistic choice to be against the dictatorship that imperialism coincidentally is completely against and determined to destroy does put them in the same camp, does put them on the other side of the same coin, and who knows what that coin actually represents. I think we have no time for any more contributions. I apologize in particular to those on the screen that didn't make it onto the show. I can only promise that next time we'll bump you up the queue so that you have more of a chance. We've got time for me to sum up the year, but not time for any more guests. Please forgive me. Well, I think you got the picture. It was a year in which what looked like 2 steps forward became at least 1 step back. But as Danny Haiphong pointed out, the overarching trajectory, the strategic direction of world events still favors the new world that is struggling to be born, and against the old world that is ready to kill everybody in order to hang on to its hegemony. The Donald Trump presidency will be a decisive one way or another. Which Donald Trump are we going to get? Are we going to get the Donald Trump who, in the closing hours of the presidential campaign in Dearborn, Michigan, demanded that Netanyahu have the war in Gaza over by the time he comes to power on January the 20th? Is it that Donald Trump who says he is going to halt the war in Ukraine? Is it the Donald Trump that went to the parallel between North and South Korea and shook the hands of the North Korean leader and met rather convivially with him? Or will it be the Donald Trump thuggishly making threats against the government of Panama this very week? Will it be the Donald Trump that is thinking of invading Haiti? Will it be the Donald Trump that, like a bull in the china shop, destroyed the Iran nuclear deal? Will it be the Donald Trump that cruelly assassinated, murdered one of the great anti-ISIS, anti-Al-Qaeda leaders in the world, General Qasem Soleimani? Which Donald Trump can we expect to turn up on the Potomac on the 20th of January? Well, one thing's for sure, God willing, I'll be here every week on Have It Out with Galloway to try and explain what's what and what's not. Thanks for watching. Have a lovely Christmas and a Happy New Year.